CHAPTER XIII of Love Among the Artists by George Bernard Shaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. CHAPTER XIII Some days later, however, when Mary asked for further news of Prometheus Unbound, she found his tone changed. On being pressed, he admitted that he had induced the Antient Orpheus Society to make a doubtful bargain. The overture and two of the scenes had been completed and delivered to the Society by Jack; and no one, said Mr. Phipson, had been able to contradict Maclagan's verdict that the music, most fortunately, was inexecutable. A letter had been carefully drawn up to inform Jack as gently as possible of the fate of his work. So prodigious, it said, were the technical difficulties of the work, so large and expensive the forces required to present it adequately, and so doubtful the prospect of its acceptance by a miscellaneous audience in the existing condition of public taste, that the committee were obliged to confess with deep regret that they dared not make arrangements for its early production. If Mr. Jack had by him any more practicable composition, however short it might fall of the Prometheus in point of vastness of design, they would be willing to permit of its being substituted without prejudice to those conditions in their agreement which had been inserted in the interest of the composer. To this Jack had replied that they should have Prometheus or nothing; that there was not a note in the score which was not practicable with a reasonable degree of trouble; that he could find no precedents on which to base the slightest regard for the sagacity of the Society; that he cared not one demi semi quaver whether they held to their bargain or not, as he would find no difficulty in disposing of his work; and that he insisted on their either returning the score at once or paying the first instalment of £500 for it, as agreed upon. He added in a postscript that if they accepted the work he should require strict fulfilment of the clause binding the Society to one public performance of it in London. The Society, which was old enough to have shelved certain works purchased from Beethoven for similar reasons to those given to Jack, hesitated, quarreled internally, and at last resolved to hold a private rehearsal of the overture before deciding. Manlius made earnest efforts to comprehend and like this section of the work, which was to occupy half an hour in performance, and was, in fact, a symphony. He only partially succeeded; and he found the task of conducting the rehearsal unusually disagreeable. The players, confident and willing, did wonders in the estimation of Maclagan; but the first repetition broke down twice; and those who were at fault lost temper and cursed mutinously within hearing of Manlius, who was himself confused and angry. When it was over at last, a dubious murmur rose from the stalls where the committee sat in judgment, and a few of the older members protested against a second trial. These were overruled, and the overture was repeated, this time without any stoppage. Certainly," said Mr. Phipson, describing his sensations to Mary, it contained grand traits; but these were only glimpses of form in the midst of chaos. I had to give in to Maclagan by acknowledging that the most favorable account I could give of it was that it impressed me as might the aberrations of a demented giant. He was quite frantic about it, and fairly talked us down with examples of false relations and incorrect progressions from every bar of the score. Old Brailsford, who is one of the old committee, turned up for the first time these 4 years expressly to support Jack's interests. He said it was the most infernal conglomeration of sounds he had ever listened to; and I must say many of us privately agreed with him. This conversation took place at the dinner table, and was prolonged by Mrs. Phipson, who taunted her husband with his disregard of her warning not to pay £500 for what she termed a pig in a poke. She was a talkative woman, shallow, jolly, and unscrupulous, with a shrewd and selfish side to her character which indulgent people never saw. Mary saw it clearly; and as to her taste Mrs. Phipson was vulgar, she was not very fond of her, and often felt indignant at her ridicule of her husband's boastful but sincere love of music. On this occasion, seeing that Mr. Phipson was getting sulky, and that his wife was perversely minded to make him worse, she left the table quietly without waiting for her hostess, and went upstairs alone to the drawing room. There, to her surprise, she found a strange man lounging on a sofa with an album in his hands. I beg your pardon," said Mary, retreating. Not at all," said the man, rising in disorder. I hope I'm not in the way. Miss Sutherland, perhaps?" Yes," said Mary coldly; for she could not see him distinctly, and his manner of addressing her, though a little confused, struck her as being too familiar. Very happy to make your acquaintance, Miss Sutherland. Nanny wrote me word that you were staying here. I recognize you by your photograph, too. I hope I don't disturb you." He added this doubtfully, her attitude being still anything but reassuring. Not at all," said Mary, taking the nearest seat, which happened to be a piece of furniture shaped like the letter S, with a seat in each loop, so that the occupants, placed opposite one another, could converse at their ease across the rail. She then settled her glasses deliberately upon her nose, and looked at him with a certain hardihood of manner which came to her whenever she was seized with nervousness and was determined not to give way to it. He was a tall, jovial looking man, not yet quite middle aged, stout or florid, but as she judged within 5 years at most of being all three. He had sandy hair, and a red beard cleft into 2 long whiskers of the shape formerly known to fashion as "weepers." His expression was good natured, and at this moment conciliatory, as though he wished to disarm any further stiffness on her part. But she thought she saw also signs of admiration in his eyes, and she continued to gaze at him inflexibly. He looked wistfully at the conversation chair, but sat down on the sofa, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. This is a very convenient neighborhood, isn't it?" he said. Very." Yes, I am sure you must find it so. You are within easy distance of both the parks and all the theatres. Kensington is too far out of the way for my fancy. How long does it take to go from here to Covent Garden Market now, for instance?" I am sorry I cannot tell you," said Mary calmly, looking at him with unflinching eyes. I never go there." Indeed! I wonder at that. You can get tremendous bargains in flowers, I believe, if you go there early in the morning. Do you like flowers?" I do not share the fashionable mania for cut flowers. I like gardening." I quite agree with you, Miss Sutherland. I often think, when I see every little vase or knick knack in a room stuffed with tulips and lilies and things, what a want of real taste it shows. I was looking at that beautiful painting over the music stand just before you came in. May I ask, is it one of yours?" Yes. If you look closely at it, you will see my name written in large vermilion letters in the left hand corner." I saw it. That's how I knew it to be yours. It's a capital picture. I often regret that I never learned to paint, though I know I should never have done it half as well as you. It's a very nice occupation for a lady. It is mere child's play to you, I suppose. I have given it up because I find it too difficult." "But nobody could do it better than you. However, it runs away with your time, no doubt. Still, if I were you, I wouldn't give it up altogether." "You are fond of pictures, I presume?" "Yes. I have a great taste for them. I go to the National Gallery whenever I come to London, to have a look at Landseer's pictures. I sometimes see young ladies copying the pictures there. Did you ever copy one of Landseer's?" "No. Strange as it may appear to you, there are some pictures there which I prefer to Landseer's." "You understand the old masters, you see. I don't, unfortunately. I should like to be able to talk to you about them, but if I tried it on, you would find out in no time that I know nothing about it. Put me into a gallery, and I can tell you what pictures I like. That's about as far as I can go." "I wish I could go as far." "I am afraid you are chaffing me, Miss Sutherland." Mary did not condescend to reply. The strange man, now somewhat discomfited, rose and stood with his back to the fireplace, as if to warm himself at the Japanese umbrella that protruded from it. "Beautiful weather," he said, after a pause. "Very beautiful indeed," she replied gravely. Then, to prevent herself from laughing at him, "Have you been long in London?" "Arrived yesterday morning," he said, brightening. "I came straight from New York via Liverpool. I'm always traveling. Have you ever been to the States?" "No." "You should go there and see what real life is. We're all asleep here. I only left England last March, and I've started 6 branches of our company since that, besides obtaining judgment against 2 scoundrels who infringed our patent. Quick work that." "Is it?" "I should think so. It would have taken 2 years to do here. More, 5 years perhaps. The Americans don't resist a new thing as we do. But no matter. Unless they look alive here, they will be driven out of the market by foreign manufacturers using our cheap power." "Your cheap power? What is that?" "I thought you knew. Why, the Conolly electromotor, which will drive any machinery at half, aye, at a quarter the cost of steam. You have heard of it, of course?" "I think so. I have met Mr. Conolly. He does not seem like a man who could do anything badly." "Badly? I should think not. He's an amazing man. They talk of Seth Jones's motor, and Van Print claims to be the original inventor of Conolly's commutator, but they are a couple of thieves. I can show you the report of Conolly versus the Pacific." "Johnny!" exclaimed Mrs. Phipson, entering. "I thought it was your voice." "How d'ye do, Nan?" said he. "How are the bairns?" "Oh, we're all first rate. Have you been here long?" "It seems only half a minute. Miss Sutherland has been entertaining me so pleasantly." And he winked and frowned at Mrs. Phipson to intimate that he desired to be introduced. "Then you know each other already," she said. "This is my brother, Mr. Hoskyn. I hope you have not been bothering Mary with your electro business." "Mr. Hoskyn was giving me a most interesting account of it when you came in," said Mary. "You can finish it some other time," said Mrs. Phipson. "Inflict it on the next person who has the misfortune to get shut into a railway carriage with you. When did you come back?" Mr. Hoskyn glanced apprehensively at Mary, and did not seem to like his sister's remark, though he laughed good humoredly at it. The conversation then turned upon his recent movements, the length of time he expected to remain in London, and so forth. Mary gathered that he had invested money in the Conolly Electromotor Company, and that he occupied himself in traveling to countries where the electromotor was as yet unknown, establishing companies for its exploitation, and making them pay for the right to use it. Mrs. Phipson was evidently tired of the subject, and made several attempts to prevent his dwelling on it; but in spite of her he boasted a good deal of the superiority of Conolly's invention, and abused and predicted ruin for certain other companies which had been set on foot to promote rival projects. He was effectually interrupted at last by the appearance of the younger children, who were excited by the arrival of Uncle Johnny, and, Mary thought, looked forward to being the richer for his visit. Mr. Hoskyn's attention to them, however, flagged after the first few minutes; and Mrs. Phipson, who was always impatient of her children's presence, presently bade them go and tell their father that Uncle Johnny had come. They were, she added, on no account to return to the drawing room. Their faces lengthened at this dismissal, but they did not venture to disregard it. Then Mr. Phipson came, and his brother in law said much to him of what he had said before. Mary took no part in the conversation, but she occupied a considerable share of Mr. Hoskyn's attention. Whenever he pronounced an opinion or cracked a joke, he glanced at her to see whether she approved of it, and always found her in the same attitude, self possessed, with her upper lip lifted a little from her teeth by the poise of her head, which she held well up in order to maintain her glasses in their position, and by a slight contraction of her brows to shade her eyes from the superfluous rays. "I need hardly ask whether Miss Sutherland sings," he said, when he had repeated all his news to Mr. Phipson. "Very seldom," replied his sister. Now, Mary had a powerful and rather strident contralto voice, which enabled her to sing dramatic music with startling expression and energy. Mrs. Phipson, who did not like these qualities, said "very seldom," in order to deter her brother from pressing his suggestion. But Mr. Phipson, who relished Mary's performances, and was also fond of playing accompaniments, immediately went to the piano and opened it. "I would give anything to hear you," said Hoskyn, "if you will condescend to sing for such an ignorant audience as me." "I had much rather not," said Mary, showing signs of perturbation for the first time. "I sing nothing that would amuse you." "Of course not," said he. "I know you don't sing ballads and such trash. Something Italian I should like to hear." "Come," said Mr. Phipson. "Give us Che fado senza Eurydice," and he began to play it. Mary, after a moment's hesitation, resigned herself, and went to the instrument. Mrs. Phipson sighed. Hoskyn sat down on the ottoman, leaned attentively forward, and smiled continuously until the song was over, when he cried with enthusiasm: "Bravo! Splendid! Splendid! You are quite equal to any professional singer I ever heard, Miss Sutherland. There is nothing like real Italian music, after all. Thank you very much. I cannot remember when I enjoyed anything half so well." It is not Italian music," said Mary, resuming her former attitude in the causeuse. It is German music with Italian words." It might as well be Chinese music for all he knows about it," said Mrs. Phipson spitefully. I know that I enjoyed it thoroughly at any rate," said Hoskyn. I have taken such a fancy to that picture on the wall that I should like to see some of your sketches, if you will favor me so far." Mary felt bound to be civil to Mrs. Phipson's brother, else she might have lost patience with Mr. Hoskyn. My sketches are in that book," she said, pointing to a portfolio. But they are not intended for show purposes; and if you have no real curiosity to see them, pray do not be at the trouble of turning them over. I do not paint for the sake of displaying an extra accomplishment." I quite understand that. It is as natural to you to do all these things as it is to me to walk or sleep. You can hardly think how much pleasure a song or a sketch gives to me, because, you see, they are everyday things with you; whereas I could no more paint or sing in Italian than little Nettie upstairs. So, if you'll allow me, I'll take a peep. If I bring them over here, you can show them to me better." And on this pretext he got into the causeuse with her at last. Fool," commented Mrs. Phipson through her teeth to Mr. Phipson, who smiled and strummed on the piano. Hoskyn meanwhile examined the sketches one by one; demanded a particular account of each; and, when they represented places at which he had been, related such circumstances of his visit as he could recollect, usually including the date, the hotel charges, and particulars of his fellow travellers, as, for instance, that there were 2 Italian ladies staying there, or that a lot of Russians took the whole of the first floor, and were really very polite people when you came to know them. Mary answered his questions patiently, and occasionally, when he appealed to her for confirmation of his opinions, gave him a cool nod, after each of which he grew more pleased and talkative. He praised her drawings extravagantly; and she, seeing that the worst satisfied him as well as the best, made no further attempt to deprecate his admiration, listening to it with self‐possessed indifference. Mrs. Phipson yawned conspicuously all the time. Failing to move him by this means, she at last asked him whether he would take supper with them, or return at once to wherever he was staying. He replied that he was staying round the corner at the Langham Hotel, and that he would wait for supper, to which Mrs. Phipson assented with a bad grace. Just then Mary, hearing screams from the nursery, pretended that she wished to see what was the matter, and left the room. She did not return; and Hoskyn, on going down to supper, was informed, to his heavy disappointment, that she never partook of that meal. So you might have saved yourself the trouble of staying after all," said Mrs. Phipson. Will you have a wing or a bit of the breast?" Anything, please." On my soul, Phipson, I think she is the nicest girl I ever met. She is really very handsome." Handsome!" cried Mrs. Phipson indignantly. Don't be a fool, Johnny." Why? Don't you think she is?" She isn't even plain. She is downright ugly." Oh, come, Nanny, that is a little too much. What fault can you find with her face?" What fault is there that I cannot find? To say nothing of her features, which even you can hardly defend, look at her coarse black hair and thick eyebrows; and then she wears spectacles." No, not spectacles. Only nosers, Nanny. They are quite the fashion now." Well, whatever you choose to call them, if you consider a pince nez ornamental, your taste is peculiar." I agree with you, John," said Mr. Phipson. I admire Mary greatly." If she were twice as handsome," interposed Mrs. Phipson, as Hoskyn's eyes brightened triumphantly, it would be none the better for you. She is engaged." Hoskyn looked at her in dismay. Mr. Phipson seemed surprised. Engaged to Adrian Herbert, the artist," continued Mrs. Phipson, who can talk to her about high art until she fancies him the greatest genius in England. Not like you, who think yourself very clever when you have spent an hour in showing her that you know nothing about it." My dear," remonstrated Mr. Phipson, that business with Herbert is all broken off. You should be a little careful. He is going to be married to Szczympliga." You may believe as much of that as you please," said Mrs. Phipson. Even supposing that she really is done with Herbert, there is Jack. A nice chance you have, Johnny, with the greatest lion in London for a rival." Annie," said Mr. Phipson: you are talking recklessly. There is no reason to suppose that there is anything between Mary and Jack. Jack is not, in that sense at least, a ladies' man." As to that," said Hoskyn, I will take my chance beside any artist that ever walked on two legs. They can talk to her about things that I may not be exactly au fait at; but for the matter of that, if I chose to talk shop, I could tell her a few things that she would be a long time finding out from them. No, Nanny: the question is she engaged? If she is, then I'm off, and there's an end of the business. If not, I guess I'll try and see some more of her, in spite of all the painters and musicians in creation. So which is it?" She is quite free," said Mr. Phipson. She was engaged to Herbert; but it was an old arrangement, made when they were children, I believe; and at all events it was given up some time ago. I think there will be a little money too, John; and I fancy from her manner that she was struck with you." Mr. Phipson winked at his wife and laughed. I don't know about that," said Hoskyn. But I am out and out struck with her. As to money, that needn't stand in the way, though I shan't object to take whatever is going." You are so particularly well suited to a girl who cares for nothing but fine art crazes of which you don't even know the names," said Mrs. Phipson sourly, that she will jump at your offer, no doubt. It is no wonder for her to be short sighted, she reads so much. And she knows half the languages of Europe." I should think so," said Hoskyn. You can see intellect in her face. That's the sort of woman I like. None of your empty headed wax dolls. I'm not surprised that you don't approve of her, Nanny. You are sharp enough; but you never knew anything, and never will." I don't pretend to be clever; and I don't disapprove of her. But I disapprove of you, at your age, thinking of a girl who is in every way unfit for you." We shall see all about that. I am quite content to take my chance if she is. She can't live on high art; and I expect she is sensible enough in everyday matters. Besides, I shall not interfere with her. The more she paints and sings, the better pleased I shall be." Hear, hear," said Mr. Phipson. Let us see about a license at once. The season will be over in 3 weeks; and of course you would prefer to be married before then." Oh, chaff away," said Hoskyn, rising. I must be off now. You may expect to see me pretty soon again; and if you don't hear people wondering next season how Johnny Hoskyn managed to get such a clever wife, why, I shall be worse disappointed than you. Good night." CHAPTER XIV. Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.